with the way that sin breaks things. And sin is pervasive. The people that we encounter are inundated with brokenness. Here's the good news, and maybe it doesn't sound like good news, but it is. Today's generations know it. Younger people are very pessimistic, right? They look at life and say, if this is how it's going to be, what's the point? Why should I bother trying to be a responsible adult participating in society when all of the responsible adults I look at are miserable? Why not do the things that are distracting to me, that I find enjoyable? Well, it turns out that those things aren't enjoyable for very long. And we as Christians, as the body of Christ, have a real gift, right? We have joy in spades to share with people who are desperate for that. So we can't leave that part of the story out. Not even when we're talking about sexuality and gender.
Perhaps especially when we're talking about those things, because they are so integral to what it means to be a human being and what human flourishing is all about. So that's why we spend so much time on that stuff that doesn't really answer the questions you came with, right? How am I supposed to relate to these individuals who are dealing with this? But it does tell you now the mindset, the framework that you have in mind. And when the Holy Spirit opens opportunities for you to talk about these things, now you can share, this is why, and this is what God says yes to. This is what it's all about, what we're working towards, and why the brokenness of same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria is so difficult. Okay? So now you know what to say. But I want to talk to you a little bit about what not to say, and that is, what does science say? So we're going to go through 6 misconceptions that are popularly accepted on social media, in personal conversations, and especially in popular news media. The first misconception is that homosexuality is innate. What does innate mean? You're born with it. Yes. Who said part of your nature? That's really good. So it's in your nature. You're born with it. Well, turns out there's no scientific support for that. It's more important for you to not see the tiny words on the screen than to not see the nifty picture. So there have been, by this point, some extensive scientific studies done on, for example, the differences between the genes, the genetic code, the DNA, of populations that experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria and populations that don't. And I will define this up front. Gender dysphoria means I have a feeling like my body does not correspond to my personality, right? So I feel like as a person, I fit in more with what I think a girl should be like, even though I have a male body. That's gender dysphoria. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. It is the root cause of transgenderism. Same-sex attraction, I do feel, should be pretty self-explanatory. Although I will say this, we need to be careful when we use the word homosexual, because what does that mean? And the studies that have been done don't agree on what constitutes homosexuality. There are at least 3 different measures or characteristics that can constitute homosexuality. The first is attraction. Do I feel physically aroused by the sight or the thought of the body of the same sex? Okay? But that's just a feeling. The second measure or characteristic is behavior. In other words, do I engage in sexual activity with someone of the same sex? The third measure is identity. Do I identify as a homosexual? Do I say I am gay or I am bisexual? Different studies define homosexuality in different ways. And so determining how much of our population is homosexual or who is gay and who is not is difficult. And maybe we've never thought about it before. Maybe we just use the word homosexual to refer to a category of people that we have never thought about before. But there are different gradations on the spectrum. There have also been studies that compare the brain structures and functions, neurological studies between populations who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria and populations who don't. They have found minor differences, okay? There are minor differences in especially the neurological studies, brain structure and function, minor differences in genetic code. Here's the problem. Even adult brains are plastic. I don't mean that they're made out of PVC or plexiglass, but I do mean that they can change their configuration in response to choices and repeated behaviors of the individual. What this means is an exclusively genetic basis, an exclusively biological cause for same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria has not been discovered and never will be. There is no gay gene. There is no trans gene. And there never will be. It is because genes are not magic. They're not wizards. They simply tell your cells what kinds of proteins to put together. Human characteristics like attractions, behaviors, identities are far too complex to be attributable just to proteins. As individuals, our attractions, behaviors, and identities develop based on the interaction between our biology and our environment and our experiences and our perceptions. Okay? And that's an exceptionally complicated process. So even the idea that there could be one gene or even a series of genes that makes a person gay or trans is not scientific. But outside of that, the evidence does not exist. Okay? One other point to make about biology and same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. Sometimes the argument is made, well, homosexuality is a natural variation in the species. We know this to be true because we observe homosexual behavior in lots of different animal species. I love it when people say this because it is so ridiculous. First of all, any homosexual behavior we observe in animal species is only categorized as homosexual behavior based on our interpretation of it. In other words, sometimes what we interpret as sexual attraction or sexual behavior in animal populations, in fact, is serving a different purpose. You know this to be true when you walk into someone else's house and their dog comes up and tries to mate with your leg. It seems like it should go without saying, but I will say it anyway, that dog is not sexually attracted to your calf muscle. The dog is confused about what is your place, the place of this new being, this foreign entity in the social order, right? Are you alpha? Are you beta? Are you omega? Where do you fit in? And so the dog will attempt to mount as a means of trying to settle the social order. Here's the good news about human beings. When we experience confusion about the social order, we can smile or shake hands. We don't have to rape each other. So that's the second thing. Just because animals do it does not mean it is worthy of our imitation. I had neighbors when I was growing up that raised rabbits. Sometimes those rabbits would give birth to a litter. And sometimes mom or dad or both would kill their own children and eat them. That's disgusting. It is also part of the natural animal kingdom. Does that mean that we should grind up miscarried children into sausage? No. Dolphins engage in gang rape. Is that natural? I suppose it might be for dolphins. But for human beings, as ethical, sentient creatures, absolutely is not natural. Okay? So the argument just doesn't hold water. And at the end of the day, homosexuality is not exclusively innate. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Secondly, homosexuality and gender dysphoria are not innocuous. What does innocuous mean? Harmless. And this we often hear. What do you care? What business is it of yours? The choices that consenting adults make about how to express their own lives and what they do in the privacy of their own bedrooms, it's not hurting you. The truth is, same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria actually are associated with a lot of harms, right? And this is what we said, that sinful brokenness has consequences. So, first of all, same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria are associated with harm to the individual who experiences them. Studies show that same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria are associated with increased rate of anxiety disorder, substance abuse, depression, and suicide. Up to 200% times as frequent amongst populations who experience the same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria as amongst populations who don't. Also, same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria are strongly, and I cannot emphasize this strongly enough, strongly associated with a greater rate and intensity of childhood interpersonal traumas. You introduce me to somebody who is experiencing same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria, and I will introduce you to the same person who experienced a broken home, sexual abuse, bullying, significant relationship disruption in their formative years. Not 100% of the time, because there are other factors at play, but the vast majority of the time. And this has been part of the scientific evidence for decades. In fact, there is reason to believe, as we'll see in a moment, that same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria develop in part as a response to, or a coping mechanism because of, significant childhood interpersonal traumas. Also, people in same-sex relationships experience far more relationship disruption, breakups and divorces, as much as 3 times as much. The average same-sex marriage or relationship lasts about 1/3 the length of the average opposite-sex marriage or relationship. Homosexuality especially is associated with elevated risk for STIs, sexually transmitted infections. The statistics that I have seen, these are not the most recent statistics, but at one time, 66% of all cases of HIV and AIDS were gay men, and 75% of gay men have HIV or AIDS at some point during their life. The same is true for other sexually transmitted infections. This is because surveys of people who experience same-sex attraction show that lesbian, gay, and bisexual persons have a higher number of lifetime sexual partners than their non-sexual minority counterparts. One survey that was done, the median range of sexual partners for gay men. So remember, median is the one in the middle, not the average, but the median range of lifetime sexual partners was 101 to 500. That's in the middle. That means that there were a number of people who had between 1 and 100 lifetime sexual partners, and another number of people who had between 500 and 1,000 lifetime sexual partners. There was also another statistically significant category of survey respondents who had more than 1,000 lifetime sexual partners. This is not a secret in the sexual minority community. So, gay pride celebrations often have, as part of their festivities, orgies, which involve having sexual relations with multiple individuals, many of whom you have never met before, over the course of a single weekend. I'm not making this up. This is not something that Pastor Solomon is saying to malign the gay pride community. This is something that they know about and in many cases are proud of. Sexual promiscuity goes along with an LGBT identification. Also, children who are raised by same-sex parents. And I don't like using that phrase, same-sex parents, because it's inaccurate. Nobody in this whole world has same-sex parents. Right? Everybody has opposite-sex parents. But what I mean by is raised by in a home where the adults are same-sex involved with each other. So that's what I mean when I say children of same-sex parents or children raised by same-sex couples. Studies have shown they are more likely to suffer sexual confusion of their own, abuse, arrest, and depression. These are well-respected, well-done studies. So it's not like quack research. This is, again, you're wondering, why have I never heard about this? You know the answer to that, right? The purpose of the news media is not to tell you the truth. The purpose of the news media is to sell you stuff. And they sell you stuff by keeping you watching. And they keep you watching by making you afraid. That's their business model. And it works pretty well. I encourage you, turn it off. You will not be missing anything. Even Fox. They're just as bad. No, Pastor. No! It's just as biased. It just so happens that their biases agree with your own. Pastor, I don't have any biases. Get out. Turn it off. Talk to your family. Talk to neighbors. Take up a hobby. Good grief. Some of you, I know, watch the news like 8 hours a day. It's unhealthy. Find something better to do. People who experience gender dysphoria have even higher rates of all of these negative outcomes than other sexual minorities. And those outcomes are unaffected by societal acceptance. What do I mean by this? The argument is often made, well, the reason why there are so many negative psychological and physical outcomes for sexual minorities, people who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria, is because the culture doesn't accept them. They have to be ashamed of who they are, and other people bully them. I do not want to minimize the awful, mean, reprehensible things that human beings do to one another. We will find any reason we can to compare, compete, criticize, and complain. That much is true. And I am violently opposed to bullying in all its forms for all its reasons. It is unbecoming, especially of Christians. Jesus is very clear. It's not just a good idea not to mistreat the people around you. You may not. It undermines the gospel. Even if they are irritating, they smell bad, they look like a truck, they don't believe in Jesus, or they vote Democrat, you do not have permission to treat them as some sort of substandard human being. Okay? Every life is precious. Every human being is a gift and a privilege, no matter what kind of brokenness they are going through. So anything we can do to counteract the reasons why people bully each other, Christians should be at the forefront of that. It should not surprise you that I am very much in favor of defending the civil rights of persons who identify as members of the LGBT community. They are entitled to all of the same things that every other human being is entitled to. Now, that community and their advocates and I may disagree about what constitutes or qualifies as a civil right. But there are some things, and they are entitled to them. That being said, if it were the case that the primary reason why people who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria have higher rates of these negative psychological and behavioral outcomes, if it were the primary reason that happened because of the way that society looks on them or treats them, then you would expect two things to be true. In societies that are more accepting and affirming of their behavioral choices, you would expect that those negative outcomes would decrease in frequency. And you would also expect that in a society over time that becomes more accepting and affirming of their behavioral choices, the rate of those negative outcomes would go down as well. But in fact, we have evidence from both of those situations that the rates persist. So, for example, studies done in Scandinavian societies, which have for a long time been notoriously much more relaxed, accepting, and affirming about same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria lifestyles, the rates of negative outcomes like depression, substance abuse, relationship disruption, those are just as high as they are in American culture. And studies done in the 80s in American culture and studies done in the 2000s in American culture show the same levels of negative outcomes for sexual minority populations, even though you and I know very well in that time our culture has become much more popularly accepting and affirming of those behavioral choices. So all I'm saying is the science does not show it to be true. It must be then that the reason why people who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria also experience negative psychological and behavioral outcomes has something to do with their lifestyle choices. Or maybe there is a factor influencing the negative outcomes and the lifestyle choices. And that's what I'm going to suggest right now that the research shows. Homosexuality and gender dysphoria are not necessarily intentional. This is the one I feel like Christians probably need to hear. The research shows there are factors that do contribute to same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria that are outside of an individual's control. Now, this should not surprise us because when we were talking about before in the first session about how sin interferes with God's vision for sexuality, the gift he wants to give, we already stated, we know there are cases where that brokenness happens in such a way that it's outside of our control. Okay? 99.999% of the time, that's purer than ivory soap. A person does not wake up one morning and say, I am sick and tired of boys, I'm going to be lesbian now. Most of the time, people take their same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria that they experience very seriously. There are experiences that are outside of one's own control that can influence psychological development. Specifically, disturbances in attachment to the same-sex parent in formative years. And this research goes way back to the early part of the 20th century and continues to be affirmed by the experience of professionals who work with those who experience same-sex attraction, right? So, for example, a boy might experience difficulty in bonding with his biological dad for a variety of reasons. Maybe dad isn't there because it's a single-parent home. Maybe dad is physically present but emotionally inaccessible. Maybe dad is physically present and emotionally accessible, but the child perceives dad as emotionally inaccessible. All of those things can play a role in developing a same-sex attraction or a gender dysphoria, especially if biological factors like appearance and temperament come into play. So, I can speak from my own experience. As a boy, I was a small child. The town I grew up in was very concerned with athletic achievement. Part of what it meant to be a young man was to be involved in sports, especially wrestling. But I was a little guy, and so I was not drawn to sports. In addition to that, I have a temperament, a personality that is drawn to artistic and intellectual pursuits, which are not often culturally associated with masculinity. In addition, the third strike for me is that I, as a kid, was emotionally sensitive and demonstrative. Again, also not often associated with masculinity, for better or for worse. That configuration of things led to me being on the periphery of my same-sex peer group. I never felt like I fit in, right? And people who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria often report the outside window syndrome. It's like I was outside of the group of same-sex peers looking through the window, wanting to be a part of what they were, but never feeling like I fit in. Okay, that is a common experience of people who develop same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. Those factors, appearance and temperament, right? Those are biological factors, right? How you process your emotions, how your body responds to those chemical stimuli is part of your biology. Your appearance is part of your biology. Again, those factors don't make a person gay, but they can figure in the same way that environmental factors, like especially attachment to the same-sex parent, or also fitting in, feeling like you fit in with your same-sex peer group. Those are not it's not like they're automatic, though, right? They're not solely determinative, as is evidenced by the fact that I have never experienced same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. First of all, I attached in a very healthy way to both my parents, but there's all sorts of factors that play into those sorts of things that just, it didn't work out that way for me, thanks be to God, right? For some other people, it will, and those factors will contribute. And we need to be sensitive to that. Most of the people whom I have ever met and interacted with who experience same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria have experienced it not as a choice. Most of the time, they went through a significant period of their life in which they did not want to feel this way. And maybe they still don't want to feel this way and would pray to God, please make this go away. Okay? But because of the way that they have been socialized, it can be overwhelming. We can admit that as Christians. We can admit that those factors are at play. And sometimes the constellation of brokenness that a person has experienced in their life leads to same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria quite outside of their control. Now, you may say to yourself, but they don't have to choose. They can choose not to act on that. And I agree with you. Celibacy is always advisable for people who experience sexual brokenness. But please understand what you are encouraging them to choose and how difficult and lonely that may be. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying we got to be sensitive about it. We've got to be compassionate about it, because the research shows we're not necessarily always dealing with this being a choice. There is one exception to that, a more recent phenomenon known as rapid onset gender dysphoria that affects most of all teenage girls. And the research about this, and there's a lot of good research, is showing that there is a social contagion factor that comes into play. So a lot of times, these young girls, they're part of a peer group that has one or more members who have come out as experiencing same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. And so they find that to be an attractive way to identify. I can't blame them. Honestly, number one, in American pop culture today, if you want a get-out-of-jail-free card, a force field of invincibility around you, where everyone will come to your defense and no one is allowed to say anything negative about you, that automatic status comes with an LGBT identification. For better or for worse, whether it should or not, that's just how it is. Secondly, I think these young girls who in some cases make the intentional choice to identify differently because of rapid onset gender dysphoria, and they call it rapid onset because in most cases gender dysphoria is persistent. It's part of the definition. You've experienced it for a long time and all of your efforts to try to make it go away haven't worked, and it continues to be a problem. Not the case with rapid onset gender dysphoria. They don't have the same kind of history, and it seems to come kind of all of a sudden. I think these young girls are terribly perceptive. What else are you supposed to do when you are a young girl and you are looking at the options popular culture gives you for becoming a woman? In the United States today, popular culture says you have two paths to womanhood if you want to be accepted and celebrated genuinely as a woman. The first path is old first-wave feminism, right? So the feminism of the sexual revolution of the 60s and early 70s that said anything a guy can do, a girl can do just as well. And ladies, if you want to show your worth, you need to act more like a man. Be more logical, be less emotional, be more aggressive, be less passive. Be sexually promiscuous. Be confident, right? Act like a dude. That's what old wave feminism says. It's not a celebration of womanhood. It's actually a celebration of manhood. It says if you want to be a woman, become a man. And I think young ladies are looking at that and they get it and they say, I don't want that. That's not who I am. The other option that our popular culture has for becoming a woman is hypersexualization, right? So your entire identity and value is found in sexually attractive appearance and behavior, advertising to the world how sexy you are. And I think young ladies look at that and they say, but I don't want that either. Well, their conclusion is, I guess I'm not going to be a woman. I guess I must be a boy, right? I don't blame them for coming to that conclusion. That's why the Christian church has to be there with a message that says, wait a minute, there's a better way, right? There's a way in which you can be celebrated for the unique ways that God has designed you to be female, and it is good. And there are role models of people who have been successful at that, and we will accept you as the identity God has given you. But that's why, rapid onset gender dysphoria does not surprise me. And we need to be sensitive when we are relating to people who are experiencing these difficulties. We need to be sensitive to the accumulation of struggles that they are having, right? And you are starting to see it's going to be ineffective and insufficient just to say to them, well, don't. Stop feeling gay, right? The healing of the gospel is a process that begins with a relationship to God based on grace and sometimes takes years. And there are some people who will never this side of glory, be freed from the burdens of same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. However, the data shows that homosexuality and gender dysphoria are not immutable. What does immutable mean? Unchangeable. So there are some studies that have been done that have shown some positive outcomes based on reintegrative therapy. That is not the same thing as conversion therapy that you've heard about in the media, right? When people hear conversion therapy, they're thinking either they hook a person up to a car battery and shock them until they get better, or they're thinking of pray the gay away, where you're going to come into our sanctuary and we're going to perform a very painful and uncomfortable exorcism on you until the devil leaves your body, right? Nobody is doing those things. The media would love, politicians and celebrities would love you to believe that this kind of conversion therapy is happening. It's being practiced widely in the United States by Christian fundamentalists. It's not. Nobody is doing that. Even if they were, neither you nor I nor respected medical professionals would be in favor of it. Because the data actually show you can't change someone's same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria against their will. Yep, they actually did a study on that at Yale in the 50s. Guess what? It didn't work. Okay, I'm sorry that you did a stupid study like that to show you. But now you have it on paper, so if you can feel better about that, good for you. First of all, nearly all children grow up to identify with their biological sex, even though it is not uncommon to experience gender dysphoria in adolescence. You may remember this. Questions like, how come the girls aren't interested in me? How come my boy body doesn't look like these other boys' bodies? How come I feel like I don't fit in? Am I really a guy? Am I gay? Am I attracted to other boys? Am I attracted to girls? Why don't I feel attracted to anybody? That's a common experience. It is a normal part of growing into what it means to be a boy or a girl. The most helpful thing we can do for young people in those situations is listen to them. Tell them you're not crazy. Assure them God still loves you. He has designed your body intentionally, and He will work things out for you. I know it's difficult now. You're not alone. I will struggle through it with you. Let's investigate together. Let's look at some of this research that says what is normal and what is abnormal, so that you can know the difference between what you are perceiving and what is reality. That's the best thing we can do, because almost all the time, even if they experience persistent gender dysphoria, children will grow up to identify with their biological sex. Also, when an individual seeks out reintegrative therapy, which is a fancy word for proper evidence-based mental health counseling in the context of same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria, when they seek that out themselves and they undergo a course of that kind of treatment and therapy for an extended period of time with an experienced professional, about 25 to 33% of the time they will experience an abatement, so a decrease in their feelings of same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria. Another 25% of the time, it will go away entirely. The remaining 50% of the time, maybe the feelings won't go away, but they experience greater healing and wholeness when it comes to dealing with the grief of the traumas they experienced that influenced their same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. So even when it doesn't change the way they feel, it helps in other ways, okay? There is no evidence to show that reintegrative therapy with an experienced professional, when sought by the individual, does harm. Again, that's just the data. I'm not making it up. So there is hope. Here, I just want to touch on this very briefly. There are genetic conditions that can complicate gender identity. We used to call it hermaphroditism. We don't use that word anymore. Now we say disorders of sexual development. Think about this. When you were born, how did your parents know you were a boy or a girl? They didn't do a genetic profile, right? And it's your genes, XX or XY, that determine whether you're a boy or a girl. The doctor looked at your plumbing and said, it's a boy or it's a girl. Well, sometimes people are born with ambiguous genitalia, right? Because when you're a baby, first of all, your reproductive parts are so tiny. And secondly, you've got all this extra adorable fat everywhere that kind of makes it difficult to distinguish. Sometimes persons are born and the doctor says, could go either way. That's difficult. What is a parent to do? Well, it used to be the doctors would say, it looks a little bit more like a boy or it looks a little bit more like a girl. Let's do reconstructive surgery and you'll raise them as the one it looks a little bit more like. But then sometimes things went wrong. Imagine how it would rock your world if you thought, I'm a boy. I've been raised as a boy. I got boy parts. I use the boy bathroom. I identify with my boy parent. I wear boy clothes and play with boy toys. And then when you were 11 years old, you started to menstruate. That happens. What does that do for your sense of gender identity? Am I a boy or a girl? I don't know. We need to be sensitive to that. And you say, well, why don't they just do a blood test and a genetic profile so they can see whether you're XX or XY? Well, it turns out, guys, sometimes people are not just XX or XY. Sometimes people are 3X or 4X. Sometimes they are 4X and a Y. Sometimes they are 1X and 3Y. Sometimes they are X and a half. What is that? Difficult. That's what it is. And we need to be sensitive to the fact that there are some people who deal with that. And so for them, gender dysphoria is not just a behavioral thing, it is a biological thing. So when we are talking about these things, it's always important to distinguish whether you are dealing with someone who is afflicted, that is, they are experiencing these things themselves, or they are just advocate, meaning they don't experience same-sex attraction or gender dysphoria, but they are arguing for a particular kind of worldview. Okay? That's going to determine differences in the way you approach those folks. But you can't determine that unless you listen and ask questions. So, I give you a list on the handout of some of the names of those conditions and their frequency of occurrence. 1 in every 10,000 or 20,000. Those are difficult. Finally, before we break for lunch, medically assisted gender transition may be harmful. It's still early. The first gender transition surgery was performed in the 70s. That guy grew up and killed himself and actually led to the pioneer whose name was Dr. Paul McHugh. He started the first gender-affirming care clinic at Johns Hopkins in the 70s. In the 90s, he left it. They closed it down because the outcomes were so bad for medically assisted gender transition. Paul McHugh is now an advocate against the commonly recommended course of care for gender dysphoria. The commonly recommended course of care for a person who experiences gender dysphoria is 3 steps. First step is puberty blockers. So if they have not been through puberty and they're experiencing gender dysphoria, or if their body has not completely developed into the adult form of the sex that is part of their genetic makeup, doctors will prescribe chemicals that will block the hormones produced in the body that make your body turn into the adult form of male or female. The problem is everybody knows there are significant negative health outcomes for puberty blockers, including heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, suicide and depression, cancers, and infertility. A lot of those are irreversible and serious. The second course of action then, once you have arrested the body's physical development, is cross-sex hormones. So we're going to give you an unnatural amount for your body of hormones that are produced in greater proportion in the body of the other sex to make your body look more like the body of the other sex. These medications have the same negative health outcomes. Pastor, why am I not hearing about this? This is the sickness of the culture that we live in. This literature is available. It is respectable. It's just not popular. The third course of treatment then is reassignment surgery. Doctors do not turn your body into the body of the other sex. They turn it into a caricature of the body of the other sex. And again, infertility, infection, a lot of times after reassignment surgery, you have to take the same immunosuppressant drugs that you have to take with organ transplants for the rest of your life so that your body doesn't attack foreign tissue, destroy it, and kill you. But here is the real kicker. Suicide rates amongst transgenders, we already know those are high. As much as 50% of the transgender population will attempt suicide at some point in their life. That rate goes up after reassignment surgery. And again, this makes sense. Because since we do not believe that same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria are exclusively biological, but that they develop in response to other traumas, it stands to reason that when you change the appearance of somebody's body, that's not going to address their trauma, so it's not going to make them feel better about themselves. In fact, when they discover this doesn't make me feel better, either they are going to despair so much that they take their own lives, or they are going to continue to seek avenues of healing until they find one that works, realize mutilating my body wasn't the answer, but now I'm stuck with a mutilated body, and take their own lives in response to that. Thanks be to God, because of the competent care of experienced medical professionals and the support of Christian communities who genuinely show courage and compassion, there is a growing population of people called detransitioners. So folks who have lived as the opposite sex, maybe been partway or all the way through that medical transition, and now are going back to their biological sex. This population is going to grow. We need to be ready to care for them as Christians, because the LGBT community is going to want nothing to do with them. And less caring religious bodies, some who call themselves Christian, are going to be very judgmental and exclusive toward them. We need to find a way that we can let them know our community is for them too. But I can't think of a better place to be for people who are broken, who are regretful of the mistakes they have made, who struggle against the temptations of their own flesh, and desperately need the strength that comes in a community of people who struggle against the temptations of their own flesh, need encouragement and sometimes fail, and need to know God's forgiveness when they give in. I can't think of a better place for people like that to be than in the house of God with broken folks like us. That's where we're going to turn our attention after lunch to what are some suggestions, guidelines, or thoughts, directions for caring for people when it comes to matters of same-sex attraction and gender dysphoria. We should continue to be opposed to medically assisted gender transition, especially for children. The outcomes are just too bad. And there are other countries in the world that are now backing away from medically assisted gender transition, who are outlawing puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, except for genuine biological conditions where they might be necessary to preserve health. Someday I hope the United States is in that number because, again, you don't have to be a believer in God to see that the medicine that's being practiced is bad. And the problem, of course, is the way popular culture views the medical profession. We've come to view it now as just another service provider, like a convenience store. I'm supposed to be able to go and place my order, and the doctor does what I want. That's not the best practice of medicine. The best practice of medicine is a collaborative relationship between me and a medical professional who is as much an artist as she is a scientist, who is concerned for my well-being and not just for my comfort. And then we work together in a long-term relationship to achieve good outcomes. And we need to continue to advocate for that as Christians.